Hi guys, Tyler Forrester for RunItOnce.com. Today we're going to be looking at overbets and their value. This is one of these situations that occurs very rarely in poker, and we'll see here why in a second. The impacts of whether you call and fold in these situations end up having a fairly large impact on win rate, because small deviations in strategy choices ends up making a giant difference in these spots. And so, essentially, this is probably the most challenging spot in poker for a human because, as we're going to see here in a second, somewhere between 2 and 5% changes in strategy, whether you call 5% more, whether you fold 5% more, whether you bluff 5% more, whether you bluff 5% less, essentially have massive changes in value. And so one of the things that you see oftentimes from a computer program playing poker is some just gigantic overbets. I know that oftentimes if you're looking at a heads-up match between two computer programs, you might see a 6 times pot overbet on the river. The thing is about that is that I think as a human, your capability to do the math in that situation is never going to be strong enough to actually be able to justify a 6 times pot overbet, because we're going to look at 4 times pot overbets, and what we're going to see is even a 2% change in bluffing frequency has profound impacts to the value of bluff catchers. So I went ahead and I made a series of graphics here based on just out of R, based on basically the math equations here. The idea is basically to try to show you guys just how profound these changes are. Because in some of these situations, so this is the fold frequency and this is the expected value of a bluff, and we're betting 4x pot size on the river, you can see at 80% fold, the thing breaks even. But if for some reason the fellow falls to 75% fold, which is a 1 in 20 hand change, it now loses a quarter pot. And if for some reason the fellow overfolds by 5%, again a 1 in 20 hand change, now the EV of this bluff is now a quarter pot, which is quite substantial on both sides. Essentially, if you're looking at a 30 big blind pot on the river, this swing between the fellow who folds 5% more to the fellow who folds 5% less is about 15 big blinds. So, assuming kind of standard reg-ish win rates, this one decision is going to impact your entire session because it's worth somewhere between 500 and 1,000 hands of value for most pros, whether you guess right in these scenarios. So the next question here is basically how should we value bet with these overbets? This is a little bit trickier equation. I can't guarantee there isn't a slight flaw in it. I did check it several times, but it's much more complicated to actually figure out these EVs than the previous examples. Here, you can see at the calling frequency, if we have a 98% equity hand, which is a hand that's good basically 49 out of 50 times. So this is the sort of hand you're going to feel very, very comfortable with. If he calls at equilibrium, you make 0.6 pots, which is a fine outcome here. But if for some reason he defects down here and only calls 0.15, now we're winning 4/10 of the pot. And then, of course, if you're meeting some player who overcalls substantially, then 0.8 pot is the number. Now, the reasonable interpretation on this is essentially if you're playing against a giant overbet in these situations, or you're planning on using it with this sort of hand, you should have a pretty good grasp of who your player is. Because I think it's an unrealistic expectation to expect a typical player here to call precisely 80% of range. I think it's far more likely that you're going to find some players, usually recreational players, who call well into here, and then you're going to find some nittier players who call well into here, or maybe even lower if they think you're under bluffing. Basically, the idea would be is that the expected value of even a slightly too low bluffing frequency is just way too high to call this bet. So there's a lot of incentive there to defect to the max exploit strategy, because if you're on the wrong side of this, you're going to lose a bunch of money. And you can run into players, especially recreational players, who happen to enjoy overbetting in these situations with hands that are good a lot, like 9 out of 10 times, but they're not good 20 out of 20 or 19 out of 20. And once you start using giant bets with these regions, these end up being very problematic. You can see if they're called in MDF frequencies, you actually just lose 1/10 of the pot. the bottom line with all of this is that when we look at this stuff, overbetting is something that has to happen exploitatively. So, overbetting is primarily an exploitative adaptation because we are never going to be precise enough with the math to get GTO tight bluffing frequencies here. We can see just small changes in strategy, like 1 in 50 hands, have very large impacts on basically the EV of bluff catchers. Alright, so that's the premise of this. We're going to go through some hands here and kind of talk about how you might structure an overbetting range if you chose to do it. We really do need this kind of key. The key idea here continues to be is, we need to know our opponent. And if you don't know your opponent and you don't know your hand strength, you really have no business in using overbets. Okay, so I went ahead and I picked some overbets in these situations to talk about. So this is actually a really interesting spot with aces. When we look at this particular river play, he's going to end up with about a 3x pot size jam here with a full house. This is a situation where if you want to credibly play this hand, you probably have to come up with some bluffs, and you need to be very precise about the frequency. He does get the region correct. You can't screw up jamming aces here because clearly you have the best hand here. I want to say always, but truthfully it's more like 99.5% of the time. Like once in a blue moon, someone's going to have a pair of quads. Now, if the river had blanked here and a 10 had come out, aces would not have 98, 99, 100% equity in these situations because of the 8-7 combos and the 3-deuce combos and the 7-3 combos. And so this hand would be closer to a 95 percentile hand, which theoretically I think in pile land you probably could still bet this sizing. But as we saw with the graphics, it's going to be substantially lower value. So I think this player makes an okay play with it. This fellow's bluff catcher is probably fine, but you do need a threat of a reasonable bluff here to get called with the bluff catcher, because if you don't have it, there's just no way to make this work. But there is kind of a trap here. I'm saying, well, you need some bluffs to guarantee these calls. It turns out that if you're wrong and the guy overcalls, those bluffs go massively negative. And so this is really a pickle for exactly designing your bluffing frequencies, because you'd love to make a series of profitable bets and not, run into a player type that, say, calls this bet half the time and you lose roughly 40 big blinds on your bluffing hand. And so this, I think, is why these things are so challenging in practice, is because you end up with two ideas here. One is, how do you play a nut hand? You obviously want to extract max value, but then also, how do you bluff into basically a known calling frequency? Because if you don't really know the calling frequency here, it can be really, really troublesome if the fellow's just having a bad day and says, F it, I'm calling. That's going to create a lot of issues for your bluffs in these scenarios, because the values of the bluffs goes down so drastically, so quickly in these spots. Alright. We got another one, and then he hits the straight, he goes all in. This one's actually a little closer, I think, because he can't have king-queen, so you're probably only looking at 95, 96% equity with this particular region. King-queen is actually a fairly common float on the flop to small bet, so you can't really rule it out. And it doesn't get 3-bet because it's in the big blind, so you're still looking at some of those combos. And then on the turn, it would be a reasonably standard call in these scenarios. So you're still looking at 6, 7, 8 king queens here probably. And then on the river, of course, it's the nuts, and we've got some blockers. So Pio may jam this for 4x pot, but this hand starts to roll into the 94, 95, 96, 97 percentile. It's never going to be 100 here. You're going to lose to king queen here, roughly, I think about 3 to 4% of the time. And so queen 8 there actually value cuts itself. Here we've got an overbet strat on the turn. I'm actually villain here. And then our opponent goes all in for 2.7x pot on the river. This sort of bluff breaks even at about 71-72% fold. You do have a question here of whether or not that's going to happen. The value range here, you can check this in your Pio Sims, is pretty much exclusively the nut flush and the king high flush. It would be very rare to see Pio shove a queen high flush here because you are beat occasionally, and being beat occasionally with those regions when you're betting so big and you need 96-97% equity, it's just not going to be max profitable. All right, so same player here, goes with the overbet. On turn, with the straight flush draw, 2-pair, he goes ahead and jams. This combo gets pure folded. Really, the way that Pio looks at these situations is essentially he really wants a diamond. And then he uses like a low fractional call with a whole bunch of diamonds here to try to mitigate the value of these regions. And he assumes actually any hand that doesn't have a diamond loses a couple of big blinds against his strategy. Now, in practice, you really have to ask yourself exactly how you're going to get to enough bluffs in these scenarios, because you do need this number to be very precise, as we noted in the previous example. You've got roughly, if you've got a 2% change in this bluffing frequency, whether it's too high or too low, it becomes massively biased toward always folding or always calling, and both of them have very large impacts on value. So if you wanted to use this jam strategy here, I'd highly suggest, bluffing 44.4% of the time, or whatever the number works out to here. This is the thing though, like, I'm looking at these hands, I'm reviewing them, right, and I do this every day, all day, and I have for 15 years, actually, it's getting closer to 20 years now. And I still can't tell you the appropriate bluff to value ratio for a random big blind scenario in this spot instantly. And so if you really think you can actually pull this off, more props to you. Because, okay, so I'm not even calculating the right number. This is how, So basically, you have to call 85 here to win. This is the EV number. 85 plus 32 plus 85. So this is the equity number you need. You need a 42% bluffing frequency. You have roughly 13 combos of value hands. Here, if he has a diamond, maybe a little bit less, maybe it's 12. And then maybe you can jam some lower flushes. And so this is going to be 42%, 58% of range, and then we minus 12. So you would have to do all of this basically instantly on the table. And if you could pull that off, you could come up with your 8.7 combos of bluffs, and this would guarantee the pot no matter what I did in this scenario. The basic premise of this video is I don't think you can pull it off. And I think that, claiming that, people can for these giant bets is a little bit, it's a hefty statement.